Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'll be going over Christianity in 18th to 19th century America in regards to the slave issue. What got me interested in this topic was that atheist and Christian apologists bring up the slavery issue in America, and it is largely unproductive and becomes emotional. Both sides like to under and overestimate Christianity's influence in ending slavery in America for their own particular purposes. I knew I wanted to discuss the topic, but I felt the lack of resources to do the topic justice. I then found theological historian Dr. David Torbett, who gives great insight into the history of Christian thinking on the issue in America's context in his book Theology and Slavery. He goes through two prominent Christian thinkers during the time named Charles Hodge and Horace Bushnell, one being a conservative and the other a liberal. This gives you a bit of range in their thinking. Charles Hodge was an arch-conservative Presbyterian professor at Princeton whose works still serve as an authority for Protestants, and Horace Bushnell was a Congregationalist minister who was dubbed the father of religious liberalism. Hodge believed in an inerrant interpretation of the Bible, whereas Bushnell believed that the Bible could be read in an open-ended, imaginative way, and believed one could find inspiration not just in the Bible but in the human experience. While Hodge was less strong on ending slavery, he didn't have the beliefs that the liberal Bushnell did when it came to the inferiority of black people. Bushnell thought ending slavery would lead to black people going extinct in America. Even though Hodge was a racist, and his view of an errant Bible made him understand that slavery was permitted and thus couldn't by itself be called a sin, he thought Southern racial slavery was wrong because it went against the biblical doctrine of the essential unity of all people. He couldn't see it as essentially good or that it should be permanent. Bushnell's open-ended view of the Bible, while it made him free to say slavery was an evil institution and support voting rights for blacks, it also freed him up to be for views of human nature that were new and fringe in the 19th century, such as the polygenetic theory that posited the permanent and innate inferiority of non-whites, which would scream bullshit to many biblical inerrantists of the day. By the 1830s, the era of compromise was coming to a close and the era of crisis emerged. Since the American Revolution, slavery in the U.S. has been a source of tension, with guys like Samuel Hopkins noting the inconsistency in promoting slavery while asserting their own civil liberty. The sort of consensus was that acknowledged that slavery was an evil that was necessary for the time being and should be gradually ended. Whites from both the North and South assumed that blacks couldn't handle freedom and that the races couldn't actually get along, and sending freed slaves to Liberia was a better solution for the racial problem. Many Northerners and Southerners didn't like abolitionists because they thought they were violence makers. It was during the 1830s that they made their statements on slavery. Hodge believed that the Bible was a compendium of facts that had to be studied with induction. Hodge owned a slave once. Hodge affirmed a moderate conservative position that the existence of slavery within the borders of the U.S. was unfortunate and should be changed, and he didn't defend African slavery in the U.S. but involuntary servitude, i.e. an obligation to labor for the benefit of the master without the contract or consent of the servant. The problem he had with the South were its laws forbidding educating slaves, which interfered with their marital and parental rights, along with got them oppressed. He hoped that by reforming the system to be more humanitarian, that would cause a change of heart and that would end the system. Hodge didn't affirm racial equality, but he believed that African slaves were still humans and that they could still be saved by the Gospels, thus potentially, but albeit not assuredly, be okay in America afterwards. Bushnell believed religious truth was too great to be contained in rigid logical formulas. Bushnell made his first major statement on slavery as part of a lecture, and it was to a divided audience. Not all New Englanders were abolitionists, as while William Lloyd Garrison was one, he was also tarred and feathered by his fellow New Englanders. He said that while he was against guys like Garrison's tactics, he agreed with them that slavery was wrong and should be done away with as soon as possible, as it deprived people of their humanity and reduces humans to tools. He also said that blacks would dwindle and become extinct like American Indians, as they will engage in vice and crime and won't be able to compete with whites. Bushnell said that while freedom opened no good door for blacks, they will at least know their manhood for a while. The difference between the two men came down to their methods of practical reasoning. They were married to certain anthropological assumptions, predominant loyalties, circumstantial considerations, and normative principles for their moral policy. All the factors go together and relate to each other. David Torbett goes over how there was three qualities that made slavery a particular institution in America, i.e. chattel slavery, southern and racial slavery is pretty unique in that. Chattel slavery is when a slave is a movable property like furniture and the master's power over the slave was pretty much absolute. To quote, "Though chattel in the eyes of the law, the slave was still human being in the eyes of God." As contradictory as this might seem to us today, this is what American slaveholders affirmed. However inhumanely masters treated slaves, they did not as a rule understand them to be literally things or animals. Even Southern laws did not generally push the logic of chattel slavery to the extreme. Negatively, the law recognized the slave as a moral agent who could legitimately be punished for crimes. Positively, some laws existed to protect the lives and safety of slaves. However, slaves had little or no power to assert these legal rights. Slaves usually couldn't testify against a white person or protect themselves with force. Protection of the slave's humanity was up to the master. There was laws against manumission in the southern states that made it hard for masters who wanted to free their slaves to even do so. The cotton gin made slavery entrenched in southern life. Despite how concrete race seems, it has always carried inherent ambiguity. 19th century Americans have said there was anywhere from 3 to 5 great races of men. Many of the same traditions that developed and encouraged racial thinkings had elements that challenged it. Judeo-Christian traditions and even Platonic philosophy encouraged the idea of all humans being a family. However, even many people that believed everyone shared a human nature said that people differed significantly in many ways from each other. There was 3 prominent intellectual traditions for treating slavery back then, which was evangelicalism, enlightenment, and romanticism. It should be noted none of these traditions were entirely pro or anti-racist or pro or anti-slavery. People in all the traditions had different takes on it, and in the next video I'll be going more into depth over that. So for now, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today is going to be another video in my American Society and Slavery series, where I discuss how Christians of the both liberal and theological spectrum, with Charles Hodge and Horace Bushnell being the proxies for that, and how everything sort of came together in American history from that. The influence of the evangelical movement in the antebellum United States was massive. 1 in 7 Americans belonged to a church, but evangelical ministers preached regularly to large crowds, and many of the ideas made their way into letters to ordinary Americans. Historians say that the piety promoted by religious rivals of the 18th and 19th century created an American identity more than anything else. Egalitarian dimensions came with evangelicals, which attracted many blacks at that time, and it did lead to activism against slavery. Pro-slavery evangelicals had to go against such a perfectionist movement in the church. Enlightenment encouraged an age of science, and thinkers trusted reason to discern laws which the universe ran and distrusted truth claims based on religious tradition and supernatural revelation. They had ideals that struck placed high on human nature. They believed political liberty was the inherent nature of all human beings. However, there were pro-slavery Enlightenment thinkers who believed that common sense established black slaves were legitimate property and thus fell under Locke's life, liberty, and property philosophy, which made them not want to see slavery messed with. Enlightenment values on moderation made people compromise on slavery a lot, which entrenched the system more, as people didn't want to appear to be dogmatic. Some members of the Enlightenment claim that races were inherently unequal, as they had been created unequal and didn't have Adam and Eve as ancestors, as they were separately created. Voltaire, Thomas Jefferson, and many anthropologists at the time believed in this polygenetic theory. The majority of Southern defenders of slavery did reject this, however. That didn't necessarily mean, though, that the people that rejected it were not racist, as even though they believed the races were created at the same time, environmental causes came in to make people different and believed that black skin was a flaw that came from the result of poor environmental conditions. Romanticism wasn't as common as the other two traditions that I discussed in the previous video, but it was certainly present. It was largely a reaction against the Enlightenment, which proponents considered dull. They didn't hold lots of confidence on objective truth, but placed high value on subjective knowledge. Romantics viewed history as more of something to witness ideals actualizing themselves than gaining lessons from them, that being history. Some anti-slavery proponents used Romanticism to encourage empathy for slaves and said that history was a universal longing for freedom. Pro-slavery Romantics loved medieval cosmologies that advocated inequality as part of social order. They could use paternalism to justify slavery, and even anti-slavery opponents, like Harriet Beecher Stowe, pushed African geniuses as childlike. Moral arguments against slavery was like that of the emancipationist argument that basically argued slavery was evil but not a sin. It wasn't the kind of social relations humans were naturally created for. They believed in gradualism and moderationism, and Quakers were some of the first people to push it. Many of them hoped that American ideals and evangelical Christianity would render the practice obsolete. Some believed that slavery was like a war, an evil but sometimes a necessary one given certain circumstances, and that while blacks deserved freedom, they had to be weaned into it due to their inferior status. Abolitionists were more firebrand. William Lloyd Garrison was a pacifist who believed people just had to be shown the evils of slavery so that people would condemn it, and David Walker promoted violence to stop it. Garrison called the North to secede from the Union in order to get away from slaveholders. They were too diverse to be effective and were considered a fractious movement. Pro-slavery people made Unitarian arguments like John C. Calhoun, who advocated that slavery was a positive good that was good for everyone and that a Southern slave was cared for life, whereas Northerners were wage slaves that were discarded when they weren't useful anymore. John Henry Hammond made arguments like that. Blacks, according to them, benefited from slavery because it took them away from their heathen cultures and introduced them to civilization. Many secular writers were rallied by the Southern clergy, and writers like James Henry Thornwell and Thornton Stinchfellow argued abolitionists were the ones that brought the church into it, so they wouldn't have to make a political argument. Some people believe this sort of pro-slavery argument came from pre-revolutionary northern colonies, while others say it was a response to anti-slavery material in the 1820s by the South. While the curse of Ham comes up a lot, it should be noted that by the 19th century, many educated defenders of slavery dropped the positive argument that Africans literally bore said curse and were thus destined for slavery, but instead argued more broadly that it didn't contradict God's nature to destine a race of people for slavery. To quote David Torbett, "For all this, Southern clergy were not the vanguard of pro-slavery thought. Schooled in the evangelical tradition, they were more accustomed to speak of slavery as a necessary evil than a positive good. When James Smiley of Mississippi first preached his apology for slavery in the early 1830s, his fellow Southern clergy criticized him for failing to describe slavery as a necessary evil. Decades would pass before many Southern clergy could stand firmly behind his positive pro-slavery arguments. In fact, many clergy never entirely gave up the idea of gradual abolition. They just kept postponing appropriate future date. Charles Hodge maintained a consistent position in his own mind. He believed that involuntary servitude was okay, but that slavery as it was practiced in the South was inhumane and needed humanitarianism. He did oppose immediate emancipation, which put him at odds with many abolitionists, and he did harbor racial prejudices. His view on slavery was influenced heavily on his interpretation of the Bible. He had mostly servants, i.e. blacks, he bought for a short time period to help out around his house, and he probably seen himself as simply a temporary good owner of them. One servant he got for the equivalent of $2,353 in today's money, named Henrietta, served for 5 years. He paid her wages and let her leave when she wanted to. He purchased his mom's slave Lena's son so they could unite. Of course, it wasn't all nice, as he wouldn't have gotten them if they didn't advantage him in some way. What's funny is that none of his anti-slavery opponents brought up his personal slave owning, even though they criticized his moral views on the topic all the time. So even his critics must have thought it wasn't a big deal. He was still considered anti-slavery. Hodge's commonsensical approach to biblical interpretation was that there was things that could be known about Christ's incarnation but not understood, like how a scientist can know a great deal about how electricity behaves without knowing exactly what electricity is. A theologian can affirm a number of biblical mysteries without being able to explain them thoroughly. Hodge was a deontologist who believed in following right principles and that they shouldn't be forsaken for a good end. Divine will is revealed by our nature but fully affirmed with the Bible. In the next video, I will be going more over how this sort of interpretation worked with American life and how even Hodge applied it to certain matters, a bit of social interpretation. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'm going to be doing another part in the series of going over Thomas Hodge and Horace Bushnell and giving their reasons for it, for being against slavery or being for it, and just how the culture back then viewed it. Now, for Thomas Hodge, he believed that Christians often err in being more prohibitive than the Bible by labeling things like dancing and drinking alcohol as something necessarily sinful without regard for context. He'd say one shouldn't make something a sin that God doesn't forbid, nor something obligatory that God didn't command. He held to a negative principle that said what the Bible doesn't forbid is permitted. That doesn't mean what is permitted is a good or bad thing, but rather it is indifferent in that the Bible doesn't specifically forbid it. So Hodge lacked a verse in the Bible that said involuntary servitude was wrong. Hodge held that to say a slave was a master's property was to say that the master has a right to the slave's labor but not necessarily to his person. That doesn't reduce them to mere things, and it means you can only use them according to the nature God has given them. Hodge said that the hereditary aspect reflects the hierarchical organization of society where children take the rank of their parents. That doesn't mean he liked that aspect, but he was just saying that it didn't deny the humanity of slaves. He thought certain laws that forbid slaves from learning and laws that forbade them from having effective marital and parental rights and overall subjected blacks to white people was unjust. Because Hodge viewed slavery slavery as an indifference, he wasn't obligated to view it as essentially good or that it should be permanent. Hodge believed that the Bible taught principles of love, and while it didn't preclude slavery, its effects resulted in more egalitarian and less restrictive forms of social organization. While the Bible didn't condemn being a slave owner, it did condemn all unjust treatment of slaves, and that if Southerners recognized the basic rights of slaves, that would result in the gradual abolition of slavery. Hodge held all races came from the one couple, and no one was denied salvation based on race. Slaves merit humane treatment because they are humans, and while he believed not all people had an equal claim to freedom, they did have basic rights such as the right to marry and have a family, the right to education, the right to acquire property, and the right to be protected from abuse. Slaveholders thus had a duty to protect the basic rights of their dependents. Because Hodge believed in the basic similarity of people, he couldn't accept American slavery as permanent, as it was based on the idea that the differences between the races was permanent and essential. Humans coming from the same biological family, though, didn't mean that Hodge thought that accidental differences didn't occur. He believed that environmental factors created racial differences and that these differences resulted in superior and inferior relationships. Blacks were temporarily inferior to whites in America, but not necessarily elsewhere. This unevenness meant blacks weren't competent enough for civil equality with white Americans. He didn't use the Bible to justify his beliefs in African inferiority, as the Bible wouldn't support that. He believed in the separation of church and state in the sense he believed while they all have a role in maintaining a society, they should keep to their respective spheres. Blacks' inferiority to Hodge was only a temporary state and was something that could be improved. Individual Christians have a right and a duty to make informed judgments, express informed opinions, and to try to persuade others. The church, though he believed, didn't have the right to make sweeping judgments on the issue. He recognized, though, that sometimes the civil law had to be disobeyed in order to obey God. Hodge condemned Southern secession as a breach of faith, and while he did support decolonization at one point, he dropped it when it became impossible. Hodge didn't believe that all social and political questions were beyond the church, even though some are. He was against James Henry Thornwell's argument that the church had no right to condemn international slave trade or to interfere in worldly policies at all, as that would make the church empty and incomplete and to be in complete control by the world. By advocating his moderate emancipationist strategy, he felt he was working within the limits of the Bible and the Constitution. He only supported the 13th Amendment because the Civil War made the continuance of slavery incompatible with the preservation of their own liberty and independence as a nation. He didn't set a date for blacks when they should be allowed to vote. He believed they should be prepped for it. He said that no man has a right to exercise a privilege that they are not qualified for. To quote on how Hodge was not a defender of what Eugene Genovese identifies as a particular Southern worldview, one that made slavery the cornerstone of society and even of civilization. More specifically, Hodge saw the end of slavery on the near horizon and welcomed the imminent demise as a sign of improvement, an indicator of the moral progress of individuals and of American society as a whole, while Southern clergy seemed willing to postpone the end of slavery indefinitely. Horace Bushnell had an odd set of beliefs, as he on one hand opposed slavery greatly, but with the same amount of vigor pushed that once slavery was over, blacks would go extinct. He opposed the Fugitive Slave Act along with many other pro-slavery laws, but predicted that blacks wouldn't be able to thrive outside of slavery and would die out in America, and he repeated those beliefs from the 1830s all the way up to the Civil War. Horace was a complicated man to figure out in terms of his beliefs about race before the Civil War and even more so in it. He did have a consistent position, though, despite that. Horace's beliefs came about from his theological commitments that gave him an open-ended theological method which had an organic anthropology. Horace came from a mixed denomination background, with his father being a Methodist and his mom an Episcopalian. As a young man, he challenged religious traditions, like how he said Paul was inconsistent in wishing himself a curse for the sake of his brethren. He became somewhat of a religious skeptic while in Yale and tutored on law to undergrads. The Trinity was something that puzzled him and was holding him back from being a fully committed person of the faith, but he eventually said that his heart conquered his mind on that. This commitment to heart-based thinking made him enemies of conservatives who wanted to carry the Enlightenment tradition of common sense. He was inspired by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote Aids to Reflection, which said that religious language was a kind of poetry that expressed heartfelt truths that were too mysterious to be condensed down to formulas. Christianity to Horace became a lifestyle more than a strict adherence to a set of doctrines. He became a pastor of North Church in Hartford, where he spent his entire career, and he was well loved by his church, whom even helped him when he was ill health. Despite being liberal, he didn't cast off tradition indiscriminately, but he rather wanted to adjust Protestant elements to the current world. He was trained in Reformed theology that was modified by New England Congregationalism. He had the benevolent-centered morality of Samuel Hopkins and an activist spirit of Nathaniel Taylor. He shared the Romantic movement's vision against the dry rationalism of the Enlightenment, which was less confident of objective truth and placed more value on subjective knowledge. With it, he shared their vision of mysterious organic influences that binded people together and gave them a distinct character. Horace's frame of reference was Congregationalism, and like the Presbyterian Church, the Congregational way was defined by polarity. While he didn't think Congregationalism was the only way to do things, his thinking was influenced by their beliefs about the structure of church and society. Unlike Presbyterianism, Congregationalists located power within each local congregation, whom could run its own affairs with very little influence. He valued individual autonomy and mutual accountability like the church. Well, that is all for today. Can't wait to see you until the next part. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there, everyone. This is Mr. Brass, and now I will be going more into Horace Bushnell and his beliefs, where he came from, and just giving his overall method of how he approached biblical interpretation. To be a Congregationalist back in his day was essentially to be a New Englander and share the common history and to participate in its social institutions. He believed that American history began with the Pilgrims, and the New England values were the values that created the U.S. For him, he believed that each individual is born into a web of institutions with human relations and obligations. He did have some socially conservative beliefs, like how he believed that motherhood was a great duty and that women shouldn't forsake it for voting or running governments. Institutions set limits on individual choices but didn't believe they overwhelmed individuality of people. Bushnell seen religious truth as a force that eludes precise definitions but avails itself through the power of poetry. Common sense epistemology construed knowledge of God to be rational and immediate, and Bushnell said instead it was affective and mysterious. Language to him can only partially express truth. Words are born out of the sensible world to him, and words of thought refer metaphorically to sensible objects, like how the word spirit literally means breath. Contradictions only reveal the limited capacity of language to describe transcendent truth. To summarize, in effect, Bushnell's method permitted him to make a broad distinction between the spirit of the Bible and its letter, and even at times the letter of some passages of Scripture. Furthermore, Bushnell found that the spirit that lived within the language of Scripture continues to dwell within nature and in human history. In order to discern the spirit, one had to be open to the truth that is available outside of the Bible. Bushnell's method said that emotion was at least equal to reason in terms of truth. Hodge was more against emotion emotion-laden stories about the abuse of slaves, as he felt it supplanted reason, while Bushnell respected emotions as an important moral indicator. To understand slavery, according to Bushnell, you had to draw out the portrait of the domestic slave trade and portray how the experience has to be like. He rejected biblical legalism as he felt that it led to fruitless debates from pro-slavery people who go to the Bible to justify their slavery, and abolitionists who, if they don't reject the authority of Scripture, have to torture a reading that says slavery was never permitted in the Old or New Testament. His open to truth from everyone attitude made him embrace pseudo-scientific ideas about African inferiority, though. Bushnell understood biblical laws to be indirect reflections of God's perfection, and thus only the numinous principle of virtue was pure. To him, even biblical laws could permit actions that weren't free from the taint of evil. God can accommodate limitations of a particular time and place and make laws that are the best the people he's giving them are capable of. Bushnell defined slavery as a practice that's basically harmful and what God permitted as an accommodation to tame barbaric slave owners, not necessarily to restrain slaves. Basically, enslaving one's enemies was more humane alternative than killing/torturing them, and so God permitted it to tame men's instincts. Bushnell argued that the institution of slavery itself was evil, not just how it was currently being practiced like how Hodge felt. Slavery to Bushnell necessarily created an imbalance of power that created legalized selfishness that demoralized anyone involved in it. While he couldn't condemn all instances of slaveholding, he pointed that even the most humane slaveholder who held slaves, say, in order to protect them from harm, could not be entirely sure that their actions were pure. He did believe blacks should have the vote. To him, biblical laws permitted slavery as a humane accommodation to barbarism, but those circumstances no longer held the same principles of virtue. Bushnell's organic language united humans in a web of natural obligation and allowed him to appeal to the common feelings of humanity, which could be pleaded for in the welfare of slaves. It was certainly a social sin which corrupted institutions, but not necessarily always a personal sin. It did, however, have a dark side, as it gave him an essentialism towards race. The family was the most influential community, with children organically connected to their parents, and the family's influence on the individual spanned generations. This means the personality of each individual is determined by pedigree, and to him, because we are a large web of human solidarity with social networks, white Anglo-Saxons are superior as they are the one race that had centuries of right nurture. To him, while individual Africans may thrive, the African race as a whole would gradually go extinct in America just like the Native Americans. He held this position even after the Civil War. He was more unique in placing so much value on alleged natural conduits of race. Hodge didn't lend race the same theological importance. It is impossible to say who was more racist between Hodge and Bushnell. One could in theory judge their racism not just by the particular racial theories or opinions they hold, but their actions and use of political and personal power. In that respect, Bushnell might be a better friend for blacks, as he did have respectful relationships with them, even if he did view their extinction as inevitable once slavery ended. Hodge set limits on the significance of racial differences, as God could be a force to level such racial inequalities. Their social visions did have a lot in common, though, as they tempered love of freedom with a love of order, and ultimately believed slavery was incompatible with their social visions. Bushnell, unlike Hodge, didn't believe in deontology, but rather he had a goal-centered moral orientation. He had the freedom to articulate moral policy based on practical consequences and adapt moral rules so to pursue worthy goals. Hodge evaluated aspects of Southern slavery based on whether they cohered with biblical laws and theory, whereas Bushnell did so based on their consequences in practice and whether they cohered to the goal of a virtuous republic. Bushnell couldn't see slavery in the abstract like Hodge, but rather observed it as a concrete social practice with real consequences. Fugitive slave laws to Bushnell Bushnell sought to manipulate the interests of Northerners and demoralize them by forcing them to capture slaves and return them to Southerners out of their own pocket. He blamed African inferiority on environmental factors like slavery and white oppression. He still believed that blacks would go extinct after the war, but was more open to God reversing that and blacks becoming talented members of society. He didn't believe that Africans becoming Christians dissolved racial boundaries and didn't come to the 20th century notion that race is a social construct and thus not an essential truth. To Bushnell, racial differences were a set of barriers even God couldn't overturn, even though he could do good work by it. As you can see, Hodge and Bushnell were both anti-slavery to different degrees, and they did share some political opinions overall, but their theology was different and they were both racist, which, like their anti-slavery positions, was to varying degrees. They both knew that the Civil War was about saving the Union and not about ending slavery per se for the North, even if the ending of slavery was a byproduct of the war. Their differences came about in how they went about dealing with the slavery issue. Hodge, despite being anti-slavery and believing that Christian love would eventually win out over the issue, he often was liked by the pro-slavery South because he went after abolitionists who said all slavery was sin. Bushnell saw the institution as essentially evil, and while he modified his racial extinction of blacks views, he never completely got away from them. What made them ultimately different was their religious views. It shaped how they dealt with the issue. Hodge believed slavery was a temporary measure and was against racial slavery as it was used to push for permanent social inequality. It should be admitted the views both men held in many ways in spite of their personal feelings. In the next video, I will be going more over how Hodge viewed the matter of slavery and to summarize his positions. Alright, well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and this is going to be the last video of the series, and it's going to basically summarize Bushnell and Hodge and leave with a pretty good note. To summarize on them, Hodge appeared to believe in racial equality almost in spite of himself. In his first major article on slavery, he found himself in the position of defending the possible establishment of an integrated, biracial, egalitarian society in the United States, even though he personally found such a social arrangement unlikely and even unattractive. Bushnell adhered to rigid social categories in spite of himself. These unyielding categories became a burden to him, yet he could not let them go. Once Bushnell had built up a structure of assumptions, theories, and predictions about certain races, he could not easily disassemble it. They both left a legacy. Hodge's nephew, J. Aspinwall Hodge, defended African decolonization, which he no doubt was inspired by Hodge's own commitment to that, even though it wasn't as strong. A better thing to remember Hodge for is that his belief in the unity of humankind set limits on the importance of being loyal to one's race, which inspired abolitionists. While it is partly true that a black person would have a better friend in Bushnell than Hodge, not all of Hodge's relationships with blacks was bad. A former slave turned advocate for black people's rights named Francis Grimmock traveled to the North and attended multiple universities and found his way to Princeton Theological Seminary in 1875, and Hodge in his elderly years was friendly to him in Princeton, and Francis said it was an overall welcoming environment at Princeton. Francis would preach to fellow blacks to better themselves in all ways and to work hard. Princeton's legacy of believing in the essential unity of the human species was something that Hodge and Francis believed in. Horace Bushnell's legacy is in the social gospel movement of the late 19th and early 20th century, which taught to end social injustice through redeeming individuals and social institutions. His beliefs that human society is a web of organically connected institutions where human action has far-reaching consequences within the web came through it. Unfortunately, his racial pessimism also transferred to it as well. It messed well with belief in social Darwinism, even if Bushnell himself criticized Darwinism for being atheistic and materialist. The social gospel movement didn't agree with his take on Darwin, and in fact embraced it as so-called justification for their beliefs. What can be learned from these two is that there can be dangers in many methodological orientations, and that while many people may come to a right conclusion, their methods of coming to that conclusion can be suspect. Hodge's method made him see slavery through a lens of abstract principles rather than that of real human experience. Bushnell's made him too open-minded to ideas with few boundaries as he should have. He lacked an objective standard to challenge bigotry as he just appealed to the emotional experience of people. It made blacks have to prove their humanity through appealing to a racist emotions. As can be said, feminist, liberation theologians, ecologists, and others commonly affirm the connectedness of the human family. While the use of this metaphor is certainly valid, Bushnell's example admonishes us to use it carefully, to be aware of what the connections are, to consider what kind of central assumptions go into the construction of any particular model of human solidarity. Hodge's approach, which no doubt had its problems, it did draw a line in the sand, and the dogmatism of said standard could go against many of the bigotries of the day, even if it didn't address all of them. As the book recommends, Christians should have a method that has an objective standard that goes behind human subjective judgment, while at the same time not dismissing it. So I hope you enjoyed the series. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.